Jim Carrey told a reporter on a red carpet in September 2017 that he didn't think he was real. People believed he was having a breakdown. They believed that the years of grief, the legal battles, Fiona White's passing, and the sadness he had been carrying since the 1980s had finally broken him. Soon after, he disappeared from Hollywood. Then, in 2026, he returned accompanied by a woman no one had ever seen before. She had spent 4 years there. On January 17, 1962, Jim Carrey was born James Eugene Carey in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada. His life was centered on pressure even before he became famous. Before red carpets, movie sets, and enormous salaries. Later on, his family moved to Scarborough, which is close to Toronto, and money was never easy or loose. Percy Carey, his father, was a talented musician who could play the saxophone. He discovered the harsh reality very early on. It wasn't enough to be gifted. There were still bills to pay, and there was always a chance of losing everything. When Jim was about 12 years old, the terror became even more palpable. At the Titan Wheels tire factory, his father was laid off. They eventually found themselves living out of a Volkswagen van. It wasn't an exciting road trip. Simply put, it was survival. Life as usual began to fade. It became more difficult to sleep. Privacy vanished. School became challenging, according to some reports. Jim and his brother lived in a tent in Lincoln, Ontario's Charles Daly Park, close to Lake Ontario, for several months. He was struggling with a childhood like that. Therefore, his adolescence did not feel at all like a typical adolescence. Jim had little interest in relationships, sports, or blending in. His priorities were aiding his family, surviving the next day, and figuring out how to carry on. He was familiar with the sensation of cold. He was familiar with the sensation of instability. He was also aware of how easily life may turn against you afterwards. People would see his comedies and notice all that craziness, tremendous energy, enormous expressions, and explosive actions. But there was anguish beneath it. Beneath it was a child who had discovered at an early age that nothing was safe. Things grew more difficult as the family continued to struggle. They were eventually connected to the Titan Wheels plant once more, albeit in a different manner, only because the family consented to work as janitors and security guards at the factory. Did they get a house across the street? That was the agreement. They could only maintain a roof over their heads in this way. Even though Jim was still a teenager, he was working 8-hour overnight shifts, beginning at 6 o'clock in the evening and continuing into the morning, before attempting to attend school during the day. Take a moment to picture that. He barely slept during the night as he worked and cleaned, and the following day, he was supposed to act normally in class. It was draining, it was embarrassing, and it made him mature much too quickly. In that kind of existence, school never had a fair shot. Jim was under too much pressure at Scarborough's Agincourt Collegiate Institute. He eventually stopped out on his 16th birthday in 1978 after his grades, mood, and vitality all declined. Nevertheless, there was a huge difference between wanting to be humorous and really doing well on stage. when Jim did comedy at Yuck in Toronto at the age of 15. He received his first harsh lesson in that. He attempted to look like a true professional while wearing a suit that his mother had tailored for him. However, there was no laughter from the audience. The set didn't work. Silently, he exited the stage. That kind of moment would have been sufficient to entirely demolish the fantasy. For the majority of kids, Jim, however, did not abandon it. Rather from offering a definitive solution, he approached it as a painful lesson. He continued his studies. He continued to observe people's reactions. He practiced control, movement, timing, and expressions. He was unfazed by his early setback. He became sharper as a result. The road became much more limited after he left school. He had no safe route ahead of him, no backup plan, and no diploma. There wasn't much left to select, so comedy became his only option. Then, at the age of 19, he left Canada and relocated alone to Los Angeles in 1981 in search of more prospects. That action was risky in every way. He didn't have much money. He didn't have a strong reputation. And there was no assurance that anyone in America would be interested in his identity. In an attempt to survive, he started over from the bottom by participating in open mic evenings and trying to garner attention. According to some accounts from those years, he occasionally slept in his car since money was so tight. Music. You can learn everything from that. For comfort, he did not relocate to Los Angeles. He relocated because he had come to the conclusion that it was riskier to remain. Where he was then to go, the effort started to matter gradually. Jim's performance intrigued Rodney Dangerfield, who hired him as an opening act. Jim was no longer attempting to win over small club audiences in silence and obscurity. So that was a significant change. He was performing in front of sizable audiences associated with a well-known comedian. The impact was the same whether you situate that pivotal music moment. During Jim's ascent at the Comedy Store after relocating to Los Angeles, or during Rodney's Canadian connection to him, at last, Jim had access to larger venues and greater opportunities for music. He approached each performance as if it were an audition. However, Hollywood did not immediately embrace him. The 1980s actually continued throwing obstacles in his path. He tried out twice for Saturday Night Live, but was turned down each time, according to one story. Some people surrounding the show believed Lorne Michaels would not like him anyhow. Before one of those performances truly had a chance. That particular aspect hurts, because it implies that he was evaluated before he had a chance to prove himself. Being excluded from SNL twice was more than just disappointing for a comedian. It was an indication that he was not welcome at one of America's largest comic gates. Then came what appeared to be a breakthrough, but even that failed to save him. Jim was cast as the main character in the NBC sitcom The Duck Factory in 1984. On paper, everything ought to have changed at this point. An actual opening, a major role, and network television. However, the program only ran from April 12 to July 11, 1984, after which it vanished. Another opportunity had come and gone in an instant. People can be broken by that kind of thing. When you finally acquire something you've been after for years, you find it isn't strong enough to support you. so he continued to grind. Jim alternated between stand-up and tiny acting roles throughout the 1980s, barely making ends meet. Those were still chaotic and impoverished years. The dream was too far enough to touch, but it felt genuine enough to chase for years. And in 1987, in the midst of all that, he took an odd and illuminating action. He kept the $10 million check he wrote himself for acting services in his wallet. In the future, he glanced at it during difficult times and dated it for years. It seems almost unbelievable now, especially since he would make precisely $10 million for Dumb and Dumber in 1994. However, magic is not the point. The preoccupation is the point. When the real world continued to tell him no, he needed something firm to cling to. Then, following years of rejection and near misses, the event that genuinely altered his career came. Jim Carrey joined in Living Color in 1990. All of his unique qualities suddenly found their ideal home. The program, which lasted from April 15, 1990 until May 19, 1994, was a tremendous Fox hit because the show was designed to highlight Black and minority talent. Jim's status as the sole white regular in the cast was significant. He was unable to rely on status or appearance. He had to perform to earn his spot, and he succeeded in doing so. He was impossible to ignore because of the physical insanity with which he attacked sketches. Fire Marshal Bill was one of the best illustrations of that. Although it appeared to be a ludicrous comedic persona, its origins were deeper than most people realized. Jim claimed that the Make-A-Death Wish Foundation, an extreme idea that was never given a chance on television, was the source of the face and energy. But rather than discarding the notion, he used the bizarre intensity and distorted expression to create Fire Marshal Bill. The outcome was unforgettable. The figure managed to survive despite stumbling into scenes like music, a tragedy that was already underway and typically ended in chaos. Ruin or fire, people couldn't take their eyes off of it since it was both humorous and unsettling. And when the cameras cut, that intensity didn't always end. According to accounts from that era, Jim would occasionally remain in character between takes, maintaining the same eerie demeanor and voice, which may frighten those around him. Later, Jaime Fox discussed the intensity of Carr's presence. That was significant because it demonstrated the seriousness of his performances. He wasn't throwing jokes into a room and crossing his fingers. He was fully inhabiting these personas and drawing the audience along with him. The fact that his personal life was becoming more chaotic at the same time as his work was finally taking off makes that time even more remarkable. He was struggling with significant hardship off camera during the same period as Living Color was, making him famous, including issues in his first marriage, financial strain, and his father's deteriorating health. America saw this daring, combustible comic on screen week after week. His actual life was much less stable then.